That is the 1 hour program that follows the talk show, and it is program number 631. It's January the 9th, 1983. For those of you who subscribe to the tape, there's a printed sheet, a bibliography that goes out with the program. I jumped a week and dated it 632. So when you get your cassette, I'd marked the calendar off by one number for January. I should have known better. It's just 2 weeks in January. I'm off to a pretty good start, right? So just take your little pen and mark it, broadcast number 631, and I'll be back on course next week. I guess I can figure that one out. I do want to tell you that the year that we cover, usually 1 year in advance, is so full of news, and I'm just going to take one item tonight and maybe go back to the other things that I usually do. I go through a few items that we talk about what happened a year ago and where we are tonight. I'm just going to share with you the information we were talking about Thomas C. Reed. That was Reagan's special assistant to the National Security Council. And just last year he was put on the carpet. He had been hired by William Clark. He lied to the Security Exchange Commission on stock that was backdated. He had information to make a profit up to $427,000 in 48 hours. The paper was forged. He made up the information and used another person's name, and he was a person that was spoken about to become the national security chief in case William Clark stepped down. Clark stepped down just recently, and he didn't become the chief. But that was one of Reagan's scandals, and I want to go into them more tonight. There's a lot of news, but I'm going to narrow on that and a couple of other important subjects. Now, about Ronald Reagan and these scandals and going into his scandals, I don't know if any of you saw the television coverage this week of the president of Argentina opening up the graves and the corpses in Argentina of approximately 30 to 40,000 people that were missing that had been murdered. And I want to emphasize the importance of one person overturning another official in an election. And this is very important with all the brahoo of Jesse Jackson, and I'm going to do detail on that next week and not much tonight, although it's in the news this week. A new president came in Argentina, and he had to do something very grim, something painful, something ugly. He charged the three former presidents of the country with murder, torture, covering up murders. He's arrested the three former presidents and is now not allowing them to leave. Now, is it bad to open up the wounds? No. That is the only way that these problems that I've been talking on the air about for 13 years, it is the only way this country can avoid a duplication of Nazi Germany, terrorism, and death squads such as the people in Washington are funding all over the world, and particularly right now, even in El Salvador, the worst. What is the alternative? The alternative is this total fascism. I don't want to be so grim, but I can't see any way out unless we get some evidence out on those people, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, and Jimmy Carter. Carter for the mass graves at Jonestown and locking up the lies. Richard Nixon for his complicity in the murder of John Kennedy. Gerald Ford for covering up the assassination of John Kennedy and for covering up Jack Ruby, who wanted to tell him what happened and they wouldn't let him. Ronald Reagan for his death squads around the world and his funding murder, and for his refusal on the Rockefeller Committee to investigate the murder of John Kennedy and the refusal to extradite a witness, Mr. Bradley, down, co-partner with Reverend McIntyre, co-partner of crime at the time Kennedy was killed, and Jim Garrison wanted this Eugene Bradley. He wanted him down in New Orleans to open up that case. He wouldn't send him there, and Bradley was involved, or he claims he wasn't, but he should have gone to the grand jury and proved that he wasn't involved. Now, these men have funded through Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kramer the death squads from Klaus Barbie and Oberammergau, the top Nazis, to killing our presidents, our Senator Robert Kennedy, the civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King, people like Malcolm X, and I have saved over the past years a series of filing cabinets, one for each letter. That's how many, 5 or 6 cabinets, A to Z, that I think were victims of death squads. Artists, writers, actors, all kinds of people, politicians, candidates, witnesses to trials, and they always have some common denominator that goes back there. And there was an article about Pinochet in Chile, how he keeps his power as against the election that changed in Argentina. That article came out this week. And the way Pinochet, put in by the CIA and John McCone, the ITT, and Henry Kissinger, and the Nixon gang, the reason he keeps his power is that the middle and the left are divided. You give them all something, divide them up, and then the dictator holds the electoral vote. So you can't get that person out. If you could get the Pinochet out in Chile and do what they're doing in Argentina and then go to Uruguay and Paraguay and on up to America, or America and South America, then meet in the middle in Central America, you could clean up the horror and the pain. The people in Argentina can sleep tonight. They know where their husbands went, their sons went. They're digging the graves. As bad as it is, they know the answer. They know who did it. And they can look at the president they probably voted in or didn't vote at all and find out where the bodies went. Now, this trick of Jesse Jackson's was the most brilliant thing that Reagan could have pulled. And I'll go, as I say, next week we'll go into detail because I don't want to skim over it and there's too much to go into. But going back to Thomas Reed now, last year, Ronald Reagan had a lot of scandals, and Alexander Haig had stepped down when they came home from England, and there was Mr. Donovan, Raymond Donovan, Secretary of Labor, linked to organized crime, and Richard Allen, who left the National Security Council. But the forging of papers and the backdating happened to a man who was to become the national security chief. Now, just the past 2 weeks, I was listing some of the people and things involved with Ronald Reagan's administration starting the year that are under fire right now, and you can pull articles on them. I'm briefly going to mention the subjects. One was his appointment for the appeals court, Sherman E. Unger, Unger, is a judge, a nominee. The American Bar Association has stopped the appointment. This took place late in the fall. They said they hit Reagan's choice. They didn't want Mr. Unger. He insisted on nominating somebody not qualified, but a person who has done things questionable that should never have been appointed by him. Mr. Charles Wick made the news this week, and there's more to come out of those papers. A lot of dirty talk, a lot of gossip. The theory he didn't do anything illegal. It's his state of mind. This is the head of Voice of America. This is the man who hires all the children of the top echelon of Washington, the children of the Haigs and the Kissingers or the Casper Weinbergers, and puts the brats in to take over where the parents leave off, like Sven Kramer in the National Security Council, the son of Fritz Kramer. Wick, one of his comments, was when Margaret Thatcher didn't go along with the invasion of Grenada, which happened to be a British territory, not American at all. He said she didn't support the invasion because she is a woman. They're sexist, they're racist, and they're crooks besides, and they're pathological liars, and they're gossips, and they betray each other. See, he may be taping conversation for the head of the arms control appointment, and then they can blackmail these people or turn the conversations over. We don't know what decisions were made by Mr. Wick on the basis of what he taped, even if it was illegal, not illegal, which he wants to get out of, and the president supporting him. How are appointments made? By taping and blackmailing and so forth. Peter F. Vaira, V-A-I-R-A, was another appointment. Ronald Reagan wanted to look in the Organized Crime Commission, and he chose this man, a former official in San Diego, who then, after a lot of brahu, was forced to resign because of his link to organized crime and La Costa and Modalitz and the whole network down there. George Sawyer, when it was just investigated, and that's going on, the story broke in December. He was formerly Secretary of Navy under Reagan with John Lehman, who gave no bid work for any contract, so that hundreds of millions of dollars, going into billions, goes to the friends and cronies. That's the Assistant Secretary of Navy. And, of course, the scandal broke just last year on John Lehman and the Abington Corporation with headquarters a chief boss in London and connection to the defense industry, the people that he was the lobbyist before. He worked for them, giving them contracts once he's Secretary of the Navy. I read that Rockwell International had so much profit they had to decide where to invest it this year. Well, why should they make any profit off of a weapon? Each one should earn $30,000 or $40,000 a year and go home, and then you'd see that those submarines cost a fraction of what they do now. As long as there's a profit, they'll make a profit. Michael, these are people around Ronald Reagan at the present time. Michael David Miller. Now, he's the fellow that raped his mother and murdered his mother. Mr. Miller is the attorney for Ronald Reagan in the same law office as William French Smith. The murder trial's going on, and the lawyer said that it seemed this kid had ectosis. That's total ecstasy for his mother, and this is around the entourage. I often wondered the only time that Nancy ever looks happy, and I've never mentioned this before, is when she hugs Ronnie. I wonder if Ronnie and Nancy have that same ectosis for each other, because the only time that woman really lights up and seemed elated is when she was photographed with her son, Ronnie. Otherwise, I've never seen that look, and maybe that runs in the lawyer for Reagan or in the family. Now, Paul Thayer is very much in the news, Deputy Director of the Defense Secretary. Stock information, again, I remember several years ago when Sadat was murdered, and I said that Gerald Ford, just days before, bought into Santa Fe, and that combined with Kuwait International, and he made thousands of dollars. If you look back on the back broadcast, a huge hunk of money that I said was inside information. Mubarak was with George Bush in Washington, and Gerald Ford would know to buy into Santa Fe. He made a killing of money just at the time we were going to invest and build in the Middle East. So the defense deputy director, defense secretary Paul Thayer, not only is he involved in this inside information and these huge profits and contracts, but there are 3 women in sex scandal in Texas also linked in with him, and various mistresses. It sounds like the Chappaquiddick affair and the women that were at Chappaquiddick when Ted Kennedy was taken out of the running because of that event. Now, Federal Aviation Chief J. Lynn Helms quit his post just at the end of the year, December 24th. There were scandals around him that have to be opened up, so the Federal Aviation Chief is out fast, as some of these other people have left Mr. Sawyer when there was a question of contracts and scandals. Samuel R. Pierce from HUD, he fired his press secretary this last week, and that was an important story. Reagan hired him. He's the black man on the cabinet, the selected man, Samuel Riley Pierce, representing the Department of Health, and Ronald Reagan put him as his handpicked man. Now, one of the big stories going right now is the stopping of news media across the line, that the news blackout is getting horrendous and really, really scary. Now, Jack Anderson had an article this past week, January the 7th, how the FBI decided, J. Edgar Hoover and the powers that be, that they would manipulate a man that was handpicked. He was a prosecutor and a judge from a prestigious law firm, and they would get the black man they wanted. They went to Sugar Hill, New Hampshire, and William Sullivan, that was his hometown, the director of Internal Division, who was shot at the time the House Select Committee was doing their investigations. And they go to Sullivan and J. Edgar Hoover, and they put their heads together and decide that they will pick a man. And the man they picked for housing and urban development that Ronald Reagan chose for his cabinet, handpicked, turns out to be the same person who's involved now with firing a woman in her department because she is revealing things to the news media, and there's this tight blackout. So the handpicked cabinet member, instead of opening up the office and going into what is wrong with the office or the situation he's supposed to be clearing up, that Samuel R. Pierce is the same person that Ronald Reagan has put on a cabinet and that was handpicked by William Sullivan and J. Edgar Hoover years ago. The J. Peter Grace, another person appointed by Reagan for the private sector survey on cost control. I'll do more in a few weeks on the expose just in the Washington Post and also in the Wall Street Journal on J. Peter Grace and Flick and the scandal of those organizations. And the Flick organization that represented Adolf Hitler and their propaganda machines and newspapers and worked right, it was the right-hand arm of Adolf Hitler. The Flick group gave $690 million from Germany to J. Peter Grace over in the United States. I call that the hands across the sea. The Germans and J. Peter Grace, of course, we've gone into his connections with Agee Farben and Otto Ambros from Agee Farben and the extermination gases. J. Peter Grace is partners with a vicious Nazi war criminal who now runs the Opus Dei for the Vatican. But the point Otto Ambros does and Herman Apps does, that's the Vatican banker. But J. Peter Grace has been close to Otto Ambros, all of them from Agee Farben. The other two are directors from Agee Farben and they were Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg. Now, the Flick Company gave J. Peter Grace, Reagan's appointee, $690 million from Germany. Recently, Grace just merged with Used Tool Company. We talked about that, and now they've opened an office, Grace Ventures, in Palo Alto, California. Is that German money that was taken out of Germany to the United States to pay to Grace to begin to take over the United States? If you watch the way World War II followed, the money, the intent, the agents, hands across the ocean, moving into our intelligence community, forming them, the business people. Now the scandal in Germany is breaking open even larger than the original case against Flick with the $690 million that went to the J. Peter Grace Group. Edwin Meese was in the news just in the middle of the year in the fall. That was covered up. Edwin Meese and Michael Deaver, two of the appointees and inner staff of Ronald Reagan, received loans that managed to protect their interest, $50,000 and $60,000 each. A man named John McKean gave them loans, and at the same time the loans came through, he was nominated as Reagan's U.S. Postal Service appointee on the Postal Service, and those cases were never resolved, or has Mr. Meese's escalation with his Army titles. He keeps getting moving on up. I guess he'll be a top general soon. He gets these mysterious raises, so he's the one high military guy around Ronald Reagan. And, of course, William Clark was in Army counterintelligence before he was in California, and then with the National Security Council. Now, there's a kickback case that came in the news the last week in December involving General Dynamics, and they don't know whether to give them any more contracts. Of course, they're close to the Ronald Reagan entourage. Involves the Secretary of the Navy, John Lehman's Trident submarine contracts. All of this breaking, lots of articles on these various subjects coming down at one time against Ronald Reagan, and for some reason or other, he still tops the polls, and everybody seems to love Ronnie. One of his appointments, Undersecretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger, to show you the minds of these people, besides Margaret Thatcher being a woman, so she didn't want that invasion. Pierre Trudeau went around the world trying to stop the arms race, and many of you might have read the quotation. He said, Pierre Trudeau's attempts to spur arms reduction talks were akin to pot-induced behavior by an erratic leftist. Doesn't that sound like the same people that were writing for Spiro Agnew a few years ago? Now, another expose to come on top of all of this is the March issue of Hustler. Larry Flint has published the pictures that he has of Larry McDonald, and it's a total brilliant piece of commentary about America. It's too bad that he's incarcerated still in the federal prison in Springfield, Missouri. He'll probably be out by the time most of you get this tape and moved elsewhere, but that's where he still is, and there's a news blackout. Next month, you will see Larry McDonald. And what he has done is juxtapose the person who puts him down, the hypocrite, with the pictures of Larry McDonald in Heat. And it shows him not only with his mistress and some very unkind words about them with their sex carrying on, totally nude, the two of them, but alongside of those pictures, he has pictures of himself, how he was shot and his spine. And then it says, here's how a good Christian loved his fellow man. And you see the body of Larry Flynt, how he was shot, and Nelson Bunker Hunt with Larry Flynt, and with him in Germany, Larry Flynt with the top Nazi of Germany, Franz Joseph Strauss, and Larry McDonald, sitting at the table with Strauss, and Larry McDonald with Falwell, Reverend Falwell. Then it shows him in positions that are unkind, but really a person deserves when they're going to pick on the lifestyle, say, of Larry Flynt and his pornography and his habits, and you're the president of the Birch Society, and you have a computer that goes into the Los Angeles Police Department where you're sending it over to Germany and Vienna and keeping tabs on law-abiding citizens. It's about time that somebody come out and say, look, here's the real Larry McDonald, you hypocrites, because too many times we laud these people as the heads of organizations like the Birch Society or working with the Pentagon and the CIA, and the hypocrisy and the mingling of the bullets that they shoot at other people who have not committed crimes, and then they go ahead and behave in a way that they pretend they don't even know these things are happening. So these pictures will be out on the stand next month, and that's another, besides some of the scandals. There was a big article, several in the Sacramento Bee at the end of the year. Paul Laxalt skimmed during ownership of casino. Large articles that I'll do in detail with you about Ormsby House, the hotel casino, and how he was linked to the notorious mob figures in Buffalo, Detroit, and all over the world. Paul Laxalt is the liaison to Congress of Ronald Reagan, and Paul Laxalt is the GOP fundraiser. You can raise a lot of funds if you skim those tables. And this is breaking in another part of the country. It's not as prominent as the Sawyer story, but or the Charles Wick story, but it has a lot of potential if it keeps bubbling open. And then Rebel magazine, the next issue of Rebel, the second one, has an article, Who Killed Vicki Morgan? And there's a section there. Bill Turner writes about Vicki Morgan, and I'll do some details on this, and Don Freed writes about Alfred Bloomingdale working for Ronald Reagan's Intelligence Committee. He had two appointments, the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board and the Commission on Public Diplomacy. Then it tells Reagan's links to John Rosselli, to crime, union busting, smashing Cesar Chavez. A lot of these things you know by hearing me on the program from week to week, but these now are going into national magazines that Larry Flynt just got out. The Catholic Sovereign Military Order of Malta. Bloomingdale is a Knight of Malta, as well as working with the far right wing, the American Security Council, and the espionage. He works at the highest levels of American spy system. He carries on with a floating whorehouse of women that Vicki Morgan was used for, transported all around. There's sex, there's betraying your wife, cheating on your wife, there's murder, there's organized crime syndicate. And this is breaking in any national magazine that's on the stand now with a mole on the cover. One interesting thing in this article, this is where the article should have begun. It was by Bill Turner. It doesn't mention much more about it. He leaves sort of a bomb here and mentions that Vicki Morgan's father worked with Robert Vesco and had dealings with him. He said her father, Delbert Morgan, who, according to Vicki's one-time attorney, Paul Caruso, was burned badly by Robert Vesco. In order to be burned by Robert Vesco, you have to work with Robert Vesco. That's where the story begins, because Paul Caruso was the attorney not only for Vicki Morgan and her family, but for Sue Atkins of the Manson family. This Paul Caruso was the attorney for the Manson family. Now, Marvin Pankos, let me get this clear so we do more on it later. Marvin Pankos, the man who has been charged with killing Vicki Morgan, said that he was in Sharon Tate's house, and he suggested the night of the murder. Now, Vicki Morgan, a friend of Pancoast, has the attorney, Sue Atkins, from the Manson family as her attorney. Now, Dennis Wilson, and I'll do more on that next week, who helped form the Manson family, the only Beach Boy who was part of that, was murdered just last week. Next week, I hope to do Jesse Jackson and Dennis Wilson and the murder and the charade of Jesse Jackson for the political game playing that they're doing. Those are two big stories, but they deserve a half hour each probably on their own. But there is a link of the Manson family, of the entire, the whole Charles Watson, and the Beverly Hills attorneys, and the CIA, and Ronald Reagan, and the defense group. There were Defense Department people from Vietnam brought into the Manson's family to teach the shooting and all kinds of activity from the Vietnam War. It was a COINTEL operation, but on the border of these cases are stories coming out now that if they go one step further, they'd get their toe into the American counterintelligence operation that has been going on in the United States, not overseas. So that Marvin Pancoast trial is about to come up, and the Rebel article is very good on who killed Vicki Morgan. Now, Ronald Reagan is trying to pass this off with some good news media. There's an article Helen Thomas had, Reagan is a happy man. If you add up all of these stories, who tells them to write these things? How in the world can you be happy? Also, this year there were the scandals of his friend Johnny Carson, Johnny's wife, Janet DeCordova, not Johnny's wife, his producer's wife, is Nancy Reagan's best friend. The scandal of that Commercial Bank of California and the mob connections, Betsy Bloomingdale scandals coming out. Another article, a select list for the Reagan Party. Well, the New Year's party at Annenberg's this year was like a war council. You had Caspar Weinberger, you had Charles Wick, who was embarrassing the president, William Wilson, the controversial new ambassador to the Vatican with all the Vatican scandals that are going on, William Clark, George Shultz, William French Smith, with his attorney's, his partner's son, just about to go to trial. It was George Shultz. This was a war council. That New Year's Eve party was more a meeting like they did 3 days before the invasion of Grenada. It had more to do with the coup in Nigeria that was taking place at the same time. Another loss of democracy, a fellow new president of Nigeria, trained in Great Britain, and part of the Kissinger-Carrington coup. He's going to do away with the courts and the elections. We'll do more on that. That New Year's Eve party at Annenberg's was more a war council of, well, how do we cut our losses and look happy, than it was a celebration this year. I didn't see any Jerry Baby Zip Zipkin there or Betsy. Maybe they were there. There was a big party. They might have all been there. But the names in the news were the head of the national security and so forth. Now, I mentioned several weeks ago, it was 2 months ago actually, some more parties in Washington, D.C. That was broadcast 617. That's the one that Larry Flint sent. He sent two, and this was one of them to every member of Congress. And I was telling about a macabre party that Roy Cohn had when he moved some office or a new office, I'm sure he keeps one in New York, into Washington, D.C. Roy Cohn was the attorney for Alfred Bloomingdale, who had just died earlier at the end of the 1982. But he was having a party in Washington, and he had represented Alfred Bloomingdale. And at the party was Marvin Mitchelson, who flew in from England, who was the attorney for Vicki Morgan, who had just a little while earlier had her head split open. And at the party was Richard Vagary, the head of the Birch Society, who had just lost his captain, Larry McDonald, into the ocean just about a week or two before. And all of them had this made note of the social sections in Washington. They were having these parties. Well, just this week, Richard Vagary in the Washington Post said he just bought into the Showbiz Pizza Place Incorporated. This was a franchise of Alfred Bloomingdale and Vicki Morgan. She wasn't broke. She had money in the pizza parlor. And just this week, he bought into the Showbiz Pizza. He said he's interested in the defense, in taxes, and national issues, so he may as well sell pizza and beer at the same time. That's a pretty good combination, and maybe that Showbiz Pizza is part of an organization, an international group that with Bloomingdale and Vicki out, Vaira, who takes care of the mailing lists of all the right-wing captains in the country, such as Strom Thurmond and Jesse Helms and Western Goals, McDonald's Western Goals, and the far right. He's the pusher for the far right, began with Young Americans for Freedom, organized in 1960 and used when John Kennedy was murdered. He's now into the franchise that Alfred would have if he were alive, and Vicki would have if she were alive, but Vaira and Roy Cohn are alive, so the pizzas keep rolling on. I'll take a 1-minute break now and go back into some more of these scandals. Now I'll begin side 2 of broadcast 631. It's January 9th, 1983. Remember to change on your sheet, that 632. I typed it in wrong. Another massive scandal for Ronald Reagan the second week in the new year is that the Los Angeles Police Department finally made Time magazine. Can you imagine? The most massive news blackout of Western goals and the linking of these computers from Edward Teller and the Admiral Moore and the top Pentagon into Germany, into Austria, into massive computers around the world. This story has been hushed for an entire year. Well, Time told half the story, but it's only been a year, so maybe we should be grateful. The story is December 26th. Infiltrating the public. The Los Angeles police officers are caught undercover, and it goes into the suit on behalf of 131 victims scheduled to go to trial next month, and how 150 boxes were put in the Long Beach mobile home garage of Jay Paul, a 15-year-old veteran of the force. I don't see Western goals here. It'd be awfully nice to earn the $100,000 computer on a policeman's salary. And where did it go from there? The truth is that in those computers in the police department are 8 years of government papers. When Ronald Reagan was the governor of California with Ed Meese at his side, Ed Meese refusing to extradite Mr. Bradley for Ronald Reagan to New Orleans trial of Jim Garrison. And these were the people that worked with Alfred Bloomingdale and the farm union, breaking the farm union and doing all the goon squad, counterintelligence, wiretapping people. They did more than what these 131 plaintiffs have, but we'll see if it goes to trial. But give them a break. It's been a year. The Associated Press, the United Press have not carried this. Maybe one news story that I've seen or heard about around the country. Most of it is special to the San Jose Mercury or special to various cities. There is a total news blackout, and dynamite material has been coming out every single week, and I've put it in chronological order in notebooks, and we'll do a lot more on it. A story by Joe Scott, L.A. Herald Examiner, just this last month. Police spying suit may be landmark. The decision by the city council not to play Santa Claus and settle the American Civil Liberties controversial suit now has important bearings, and it goes into the implications of what this means when this information comes out. They're calling it a landmark case, and it is still, except for World Watchers, the most, if you don't get it here, it is the most hushed up story going. Incidentally, the story for the New York Times on the Flick organization was titled "Germany Revokes Flick Tax Benefits," and that's because they had sent to Mr. Grace the bulk of $690 million in capital gains when they sold Daimler-Benz, the automobile company, and sent this out to Mr. J. Peter Grace in the United States. And this is a large scandal. Now, Mr. Flick, the Flick organization, and Flick was released from the Nuremberg jails by John J. McCloy. It said the Flick has close links between its subsidiaries, including Dynamite Nobel Chemical Company and units of Grace. Dynamite Nobel is the Nobel people. George DeMohrenschildt, who was Lee Harvey Oswald's babysitter from our Defense Department intelligence, his father managed the Nobel interests where they made dynamite and were using it for oil exploration that went into weapons. The Nobel interests are tied up to the CIA, the OSS, and the CIA. And Mr. Flick from Nazi Germany and J. Peter Grace and his German partners are mentioned in terms of dynamite Nobel chemical. You don't see that very often, but it's there if you want to see it. Now, I want to mention something about Grenada because I've been following the Grenada story for you on World Watchers continuously and putting an emphasis on two things: the media control and the mental hospital, the body count in the mental hospital. Instead of a one-part story for Rebel, I am doing a three-part story, breaking into three parts, which is better. Decided to wait till Larry Flynn is out, then I'll give him the three-part, but I've been working continuously on it. Now, Covert Action came out with a long 30-page on the Grenada event, and I was anxious to see what these people from Washington, D.C. put about the things that I was interested in. How do they cover the area that I picked out as being important? The Rebel this month has a story on Grenada. You can read it. It's about planning the invasion in 1981. It's a total puff piece. It may be of interest to you if you don't know they wanted to go in there 2 years earlier, but it doesn't have a beginning or an end. You can forget that. But Covert Action has a story, and they have a picture on page 14 of their article. The U.S. Rangers surveys a mental hospital rubble. After a perfunctory search for bodies, the Pentagon ordered the entire building demolished. The Pentagon ordered the mental hospital demolished. That's an interesting thing for us to do, to go into another country. And you know, I'm linking it to experiments in Jonestown and who was in the hospital. They make another mention about the mental hospital, just a short mention. It's how the American students came home and the media showed them kissing the airport runway, groveling on the ground, instead of a mental hospital blasted to smithereens, patients and all. So they make another reference in this 30-page article, I forget which it was, of the mental hospital. Then they get into the psychological warfare that the United States used. It's a very important story. It said as soon as the CIA and the American Army came in, they began their psychological operations, and the mind control operations involved erasing symbols of Maurice Bishop's New Jewel movement. But they gave three things that they took care of, or four things. It said they bombed Mr. Butler's house, Radio Free Grenada, that used to be open for them, and even Bishop's mother's house that they wanted to do away with, and which they used the excuse it was hit by accident, like the mental hospital. So Covert Action has made three references to the mental hospital, which is interesting. But then when they go to the section called body counts, which I've done extensive work on, and I just want to show how some parts are printed and some are left out, and how you have to go to a lot of different sources for information. When they get to the body counts, they're very careful to denote the amount of Cubans, the lies, or the discrepancies in those body counts. Then they go to the civilians in Grenada and count those body counts, but they leave out the people from the mental hospital. They only go into the civilians, which would be people in the mental hospital, and they suggest the possibility of mass graves, 100 or 200, and so forth. But they don't pursue it. So they know the mental hospital is important. It was ordered by the Pentagon to be destroyed. They think that 4 landmarks were destroyed purposely, including Bishop's home, his mother's home, and like the mental hospital. But when it gets to the numbers game and the bodies, they leave it out completely. I don't interpret why, and I don't know, but it's important to show this difference in how they realize there's a picture of it, and the Pentagon has ordered it. And just like the Vicki Morgan story that is in Rebel, written by Bill Turner, he casually tells about Vicki's father working with Robert Vesco. Then he begins the story by saying she was picked up in front of a restaurant by Alfred Bloomingdale. Vesco ran a team of women, hundreds of women, for the intelligence, for the Pentagon, for blackmail, for the industry. So Vicki Morgan, maybe he wanted her picked to get even with the father, or maybe they recommend a job for her with Alfred Bloomingdale. If Vesco is involved with the Vicki Morgan family, It puts another story on the fact that a man as prominent and wealthy as Alfred Bloomingdale, with both the stores and forming the Diners Club and forming the kitchen cabinet for Ronald Reagan, and he can have all the chicks in Hollywood. Anybody would be glad to go, and the CIA screens him. He's working with the highest level of counterintelligence. Why would he go to a restaurant and just pick a woman and up to his house and take that woman? So these stories give a little hint of something, but they don't go all the way. Now, one story, that part of the story that they have on the psychological warfare that goes now, and it's very important because this has to do with the idea of why Western goals is so important and why it's cut out and what is happening in the media today. It mentions a woman, a nurse that worked, Regina Fuchs, Fuchs, a West German nurse who was working at a clinic in Grenada for a year and a half. And she was picked up, and her story was told in the Washington Post, and for 2 days she was kept in the Richmond Hill jail after the Americans invaded the island. Now, several weeks ago on the broadcast, I mentioned how they brought in computers. And I said, what kind of population is there with 100,000 people picking nutmeg? What kind of population do you need these expensive computers on an island when you come into invade? Because you could almost separate the factions there very quickly. And why did we go into this island with the computers? Well, this nurse said she was kept in the Richmond Hill jail, and they asked her questions relentlessly. And these were the questions. She mentioned 3. There must have been more in 2 days. But these were 3 of the questions. Has she ever demonstrated against the Vietnam War? Has she ever demonstrated? The CIA, the Pentagon, wants to know if this woman from West Germany ever demonstrated against the Vietnam War. That is important. They asked her whether she knew anybody who attended the medical school, because those were, I'm sure, all being trained as agents for the Defense Department and the CIA to be placed around the world and in America when they get out, and I'll be doing more of that in the article, and if she ever met Philip Agee in Germany. Now, the point about the Vietnam War, here's Edward Teller, I mentioned before, the father of the hydrogen bomb, on the board of Western Goals. Every petition against the Vietnam War in any major city, and we're talking about a lawsuit, particularly in Los Angeles, where all these files were ordered destroyed, 1974, 1975, were kept because they intend to use those when they round people up, when they take states, when they take this country, any other country, but they're testing these computers. Did she demonstrate against the Vietnam War? I'm sure that a young nurse living in West Germany and then moving down to Grenada hardly knew what the Vietnam War was about 10 years ago. But these are standard questions. And how would she, in Germany she would demonstrate? Maybe she didn't like it. But the fact that this is a question and that everyone who did demonstrate is in the file, and they go to Mr. Steinholtz, a pilot of the Luftwaffe, to Admiral Moore, the right-hand man of Henry Kissinger, the former chief of staff to Edward Teller, who invented the hydrogen bomb. And I told you before, if you don't like the bomb, he'll find out who you are. So when they set up those heavy computers down there in Grenada, they're testing. And if they don't know it's testing, you better be careful, because I think it's worth my going slow in spite of all the news and tell you about it. Now, another article came out this week in the San Jose Mercury from the Night Rider News Service about the Salvadoran Army. It was titled, "Demoralized Salvadoran Army Hastily Buries Its Dead." We hear a lot about the dead in El Salvador. What makes this article different? There was Nazi Germany, there was Jonestown, there was Grenada, and now El Salvador. Who is going to be next? They took the bodies from one particular battle, the Salvadoran Army. They were dumped in trenches with bulldozers over them and then shoved the dirt with hundreds dead. No altar, no priest, no prayer, no white cross to indicate the spot. They didn't want anyone to know where they were. Now, this is a Catholic country, and they were members of the army. These weren't rebels. These were members of the Salvadoran Army. The families were not notified. There were no death certificates and no identification on the bodies. After the mass burial, they started rounding up 250 fresh teenagers, still in their just civilian clothes, going around town, herded them into cattle trucks, and drove them away to the army to get them ready to be part of the army. Does that remind you of Nazi Germany, the cattle trucks, and rounding up people and taking them away in cattle trucks? The article says the burials were devoid of armed services pomp and ceremony, approximately 160 or more bodies. Now, if the opposing side had killed this many people, 160 to 300 bodies, they would want to show how bad the other side is, and they would display the coffins just like Mitterrand did in France, or we do when the bodies came home, the Marines from Lebanon. We display the bodies with our flags over it to show how bad the bad guys are. So the question is, were these bodies covered up because there was something else happening? The soldiers were ordered the reporters then away from the mass internment at gunpoint. Again, they were shot down at Grenada if they came to the island at the time that the Pentagon had targeted the mental hospital. They were the boat was actually shot at, and they were threatened. They were kept back 5 days. The soldiers ordered the reporters away at gunpoint, and then the records of identification were burned. This is exactly what I said happened with Robert Pastor from the National Security Council, who worked for Mr. Brzezinski, and Jimmy Carter at Jonestown, when the tags were taken off and people put in mass graves so they couldn't be identified. I asked a friend what she thought was happening, and she suggested maybe it is chemical warfare, just as it was suggested at Jonestown, where masses of people died. And Mrs. Layton was the lady who helped start Fund Jim Jones with money from Germany, one of the people, and her husband was in charge of chemical biological warfare at the proving grounds in Utah where the sheep died, and has worked for the Defense Department and covered up those mass deaths where they quickly died. What was on these people, and why didn't they want the families to see them and no undertakers? Now, along that point, what is next? There was a story, San Jose Mercury this week, San Jose Civic Center eyed as the new morgue site. San Jose needs 15 to 20,000 feet of morgue. They'll spend $1 to $2 million, considering the San Jose Civic Center, where 750 corpses could be refrigerated, at least 750, maybe more. This is getting like the movie Comer. They want a large morgue at the Civic Center in Santa Clara County. The coroner is asking where they'd freeze 75 or more. What is going on? It's a ominous thing to see this thing grow and develop. They're practicing digging graves in West Germany. The American Army and the Germans are furious about that. Now, this week there was another article in the San Jose Mercury, an editorial, Goebbels Talk from Pakistan, and it tells about the election of the Pakistan president, Mr. Zia-ul Haq, H-A-Q, this past week. And there were at least 60 deaths in conjunction with the murder just at election time. And right after he was elected, the Pakistan Times had an article saying that the Western media is controlled by the capitalist Jews who don't like the Muslim world, and the editorial is called Goebbels Talk from Pakistan. Now, at the same time that this talk, the speeches of Goebbels, the propaganda minister for Adolf Hitler, are coming out in Pakistan, and goodness knows what else, the United States has decided to give Pakistan in 1984 a small sum of billions of dollars after the election, not billions, $525.8 million of United States money in Pakistan for 1984. This is the talk coming out of Pakistan, and it was Henry Kissinger, who just was doing his Central American tour, who has now come out, as you would know, for millions of dollars for the death squads to be funded through 1984-85 for Central America. Henry Miller played a major role in the murder of the president of Pakistan. They had a democracy, and the president murdered Mr. Bhutto to get Zia in. He was instrumental in Chile in the murder of Allende, and Mr. Pinochet, the Nazi, came in power. Kissinger and Carrington Associates were instrumental in the murder of Maurice Bishop in Grenada, and Sir Eric Gary, who trained his goon squads with Pinochet in Chile, and is involved with the narcotic combinations around the world, narcotics and Nazi. Kissinger, Carrington, via London to Barbados, and with Alexander Haig and Mr. Califano and the usual gang, played a good part in getting Sir Eric Gary ready to return now to Grenada and make the place safe for Robert Vesco and organized crime and the Nazis that tried to take Dominica. Henry Kissinger is a international disease. The people that he puts in power are talking this Nazi Goebbels propaganda. They're talking it, they're acting it, and if people don't understand the danger of Henry Kissinger, who I hit at week after week, and his mentor, Mr. Fritz Kramer, and their interconnecting links to these other stories, if you can't get that one straight and get him out of office before the Constitution is changed to make him president, then we must be a pretty sick country if we can't move before that suggestion is made. The San Francisco Examiner had a story, Kissinger panel expected to urge $1 billion for Central America. He wants to turn every inch of the earth, starting with Mossadegh, the elected democracy in Iran, putting in the Pahlavi family that was Nazi, and going all over the globe if you want a geography course on that. Incidentally, Mr. Bourne, Dr. Peter Bourne, is described in the Covert Action article as being a known carrier for the CIA in various countries. There's an article in the Chicago Sun about his role, and I'll have the footnotes in my Grenada article. But in 1977, when this came out about Dr. Peter Bourne as being a carrier for agents, he was in Pakistan in 1977, and he worked for Richard Nixon and then Gerald Ford and then Jimmy Carter, and he's still in Washington advising on these various coups and operations, and Sir Eric Gary would go to him. He knew where to go, and his father was one of the two people that formed the medical school at Grenada. Dr. Peter Bourne was in Pakistan when Henry Kissinger was arranging the death of Bhutto and Zia came to power. These men, their lives overlap in Chile with Pinochet, in Pakistan with Zia, the United States with the importation of drugs, allegedly investigating or trying to stop drugs involved with that, and the Southeast Asian War. And they have carried through they're not Republicans, they're not Democrats. They are major, actually, drug dealers spreading fascism around the world and moving up into power and advising a lot of people to keep their turf going. Now, in all of this, there is these stories I've mentioned. This is horrendous media blackout, starting with Samuel Pierce, who hires his secretary because she's too open. That's the FBI, handpicked by J. Edgar Hoover and William Sullivan, and now appointed to a position by Ronald Reagan. Look what happened to Larry Flynt when he began to publish about Larry McDonald and the John Kennedy assassination and the Nazis. He was completely incarcerated, and Alden made to look that he was really crazy. The news blackout of the Western Goals with the police department, a whole year of suppression of the news coming out. The suppression and covert action of the mental hospital and the figures, leaving that out. The suppression in El Salvador of the mass graves and taking the IDs off these bodies and mass burying them and threatening to shoot the reporter. The threatening to shoot reporters for the invasion of Grenada. The suppression of the news is a big story that will continue. And the news people are either handpicked or bargained off in some way. They can't be that dumb. If I'm seeing all these articles, it can't possibly be that there isn't one with courage to pick up these stories and get them moving more than just the first day that they come out. Now, another suppression of the news was a San Jose Mercury story on the Newsweek editor who ran Hitler on the cover, quits after 16 months. He's out. William Broyles, Broyles. Now, because of the Hitler diary, he is now released from the Newsweek, which is owned by Katharine Graham and the Washington Post. So that there are a series of media people being killed, media people being fired, that take over the media, huge combines now moving in, Mr. Murdoch in Chicago. There's a change of media on TV and on radio, and it's a tremendous process of suppressing the on-site view. Now, if we have this in our time in Grenada, and if we have the suppression in El Salvador, then when it happens, say in California, where they're getting the Civic Auditorium for those graves, no one in New York will know, and no one in L.A. might know what's happening if a bomb goes off or a provocateur, and they round up these bodies and put them in the $2 million mortuary. This never should have been allowed at any time at Jonestown, but the arrival of the troops in Grenada, kept at Barbados, is a symptom of something very terrible that is going to happen if people don't really get to it very quickly. Next week, as I say, I'm going into Dennis Wilson. That's one of the subjects. What he was doing at the time he drowned, who was on the boat with him. If any of you know Al Jardine, he's one of the Beach Boys, and he lives here on the peninsula. If any of you know him, ask him to call me, because it may be painful for him to talk about it, but I would really like to ask him some questions. There were 4 people on the boat. Bill Oster, who he knows, is one of them, and Dennis Wilson. And then there were 2 women, and Dennis's wife called the boat at 4:30. And a woman, she says, a woman answered. She didn't identify her name. A woman answered and hung up on me and said, we're busy. And they were under stress. Now, if that's the exact time that he was drowning, if you'd say, call a doctor, call the ambulance, you'd be glad the phone rang at that moment, because you would want to get help. It's like Kathy Smith over at the Hotel John Belushi. She doesn't go to the desk or pick up the phone and say, come quick, he's not breathing. She waits till he stops breathing and goes out for breakfast and then comes back. They hung up on his wife, and that was exactly at the time he was dying. And he did have a hit on the head. It's hard to get that when you're diving in water. But he had a hit on the head and went under. And he also was in a detox center several days before this happened. And according to the doctor, 2 people came and checked him out. Several people checked him out of the center, and the doctor noticed that he was upset and wondered. The visitors came. He said he was there 2 days, and then he had some visitors. He got upset and left the hospital. Well, who were the visitors at the hospital that he drove away with, and where did he go in that interim between when he drove away and when he got on the boat? And that was to be fatal. So at 4:30, his wife calls, and this person says, a woman answered. She was kind of rude. She said, we've got some trouble here, and slammed down the phone, and he did have a gash on his head. So the people that took him out of the detox center are people to investigate why he was upset when he saw them. You see, at the time of this particular drowning, when he died, is just 2 or 3 weeks prior, as I said before, to the trial of Marvin Pancoast, who said he was associated with the Manson family, and Dennis Wilson was associated with Charles Manson and made a record with him and helped set up the Manson family. So it just may be that he knows something that Pancoast was threatening to tell as part of his security at the trial. The very fact that he blurred that out the moment he was arrested, his relationship to the Manson family, or Vicki Morgan, again with the same attorney in common as the Manson family, Sue Atkins. So the people that took him out of the hospital are the people to look for. And the 2 women on the boat that hung up on his wife, she didn't say, Sarah said, come quick or do something. She didn't identify her by name. She just said there was this frantic call. And as I say, next week, I'm going into an article you may or may not have seen in the Wall Street Journal, January the 4th, 1984, What Makes Jesse Jackson Run? And it's about his role when Martin Luther King was killed. I've mentioned this on the air many times, how he commercialized it, how he used it, how he wore a bloodied shirt and said Martin's head was in his lap when it wasn't, his role with Coca-Cola Company and Hublin and Anheuser-Busch, the beer people, that goes back to Mr. Thayer and the scandals at the Pentagon, those things in common with Jesse Jackson. Those stories are weaving and meshing together. There's a lot of stories breaking that are related to each other. So I'll do more on Dennis Wilson and the Beach Boys next week, and also on Jesse Jackson and some of the links to Mr. Thayer and the Defense Department and scandals of Jesse Jackson. Don't vote for him yet. Wait till next week. Okay, that's all for now. My time is up, and it's Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week. This is KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California.